The room was the first thing Mabel Dugan noticed when she stepped down from the wagon, her travel-worn boots hitting the dry Colorado earth with a thud that sent a small plume of dust curling around her ankles. She had ridden 4 days from Denver on a buckboard with a taciturn driver named Hector who smelled of tobacco and said nothing more than what the weather demanded of him, and she had spent those 4 days convincing herself she was doing the right thing. She had never agreed to come. That was the truth of it, the dark secret she carried like a stone in her chest. She had written one letter. One single letter asking about the land, asking what the winters were like, asking whether a woman with a teaching certificate and $22 to her name could make something of herself out here in the San Juan foothills of Colorado. She had asked questions. She had not said yes, but the room was there. It jutted off the east side of the cabin like a new thought, its pine boards still bright gold in the late afternoon sun, the wood so fresh it had not yet been touched by a single season's worth of wind or snow or memory. It was perfectly constructed, careful and deliberate, every plank fitted true, a small window cut into its eastern wall, framed with hand-smoothed timber. It was beautiful in the way that a trap is beautiful before it snaps shut, and on the porch of the main cabin stood Matthew Vaughn, watching her with eyes the color of deep river water, his hat in his hands, his expression caught somewhere between hope and the kind of careful, braced stillness a man wears when he's prepared for a blow. Mabel stared at the room. She stared at him. She pointed. "Who is that for?" The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence of wide open country. It was the breathless silence of a man who has already confessed something he cannot take back, who has built the evidence of his secret longing into the very walls of his home and cannot now claim he meant something else. Matthew Vaughn turned his hat twice in his hands. He looked at the room, and then he looked back at her, and something honest and terrible moved across his face. "It's for you," he said quietly, "if you want it." Mabel felt the heat rise up her throat and into her face, and it was not from the August sun hammering down on the valley. It was the feeling of being known before she was ready to be known. It was the feeling of someone having built a future for her out of their own longing without asking permission. And the terrifying part was that the room was exactly the right size, exactly the right placement, and through that little east window she could see all the way across the meadow to where the mountains turned purple in the late daylight. She had not agreed to come, and yet here she stood. 3 months earlier, in the spring of 1883, Mabel Dugan had been sitting in the back room of the Denver Public Library, where she worked 3 days a week cataloging donated books, eating a hard-boiled egg over a copy of the Rocky Mountain News, when she read the notice. It was not a formal advertisement in the way that the mail-order bride notices sometimes were, those carefully worded appeals from lonely ranchers that read like livestock descriptions. This was a letter to the editor, and it had been written by a man named Matthew Vaughn of Harlan Creek, Colorado, and it was about books. He wrote that the nearest schoolhouse to his valley was 30 miles east, that the children of the 3 farming families who had settled the creek drainage were growing up without letters, and that he had recently come into possession of 47 volumes through the estate sale of a deceased neighbor, and he did not know what to do with them. He wrote that what the valley needed was someone who understood books and education, someone with purpose. He wrote it plainly and without sentiment, but something in the construction of his sentences, the way he chose each word as if he had weighed it carefully and set it down precisely where it belonged, made Mabel read the letter twice. Then a third time. She wrote to the newspaper asking them to forward a letter to Mr. Vaughn of Harlan Creek. She asked her questions. She was practical about it. She was 26 years old. She had grown up in Cincinnati. She had trained as a teacher, though the Cincinnati School Board had declined to offer her a permanent post on the grounds that a woman of her, quote, independent temperament, unquote, might prove disruptive to the established curriculum. She had come to Denver 2 years before looking for something she could not quite name, and she had not found it yet, and 47 books in a mountain valley felt like the beginning of a thread worth pulling. Matthew Vaughn wrote back within 2 weeks, which meant he had sent his reply the same day or the day after her letter arrived, which meant he had been waiting for it, though she did not yet understand what that meant. His reply was 3 pages long and contained a map of the valley drawn in a careful hand, with every family's homestead marked, the creek labeled, the elevation noted at 3 different points, and a small notation in the corner that said the wildflowers in the meadow below the East Ridge came up in late May and lasted sometimes until July. The books, he wrote, were currently housed in his spare bedroom and were being used as a shelf for his saddle bags, which he admitted was not their best use. There were 7 children across the 3 families who had no formal schooling. His own cabin was a single room with a loft, solidly built, with a stone fireplace that drew clean, and he had 40 acres under his name and a further 200 of grazing lease, and he ran 60 head of cattle and 12 horses, and he was 31 years old, and he had come to Colorado from Tennessee in 1876, and he had been in this valley for 4 years, and he believed, he wrote carefully, that it was the finest piece of ground he had ever stood on. He did not propose anything. He offered nothing formal. He simply told her the truth of his life as if he trusted her to know what to do with it. Mabel read that letter 11 times. She kept it in the inner pocket of her coat for 3 weeks before she admitted to herself why she kept touching it throughout the day. She wrote back. Then he wrote. Then she wrote. By the time summer settled over Denver like a hot wool blanket, they had exchanged 8 letters, and each one had grown longer and more honest and more weighted with the particular kind of longing that builds between 2 careful, self-sufficient people who have decided, without quite meaning to trust each other. He told her about the dark winter of 1880 when 3 feet of snow had fallen in 2 days, and he had spent 4 days alone in the cabin with nothing but the sound of the wind, and a volume of Shakespeare he had found wedged under a fence post. She told him about her father's hidden gambling debts, discovered after his death, that had shattered her family's respectability in Cincinnati and left her mother bitter and Mabel free, in the brutal way that catastrophe sometimes produces freedom. She told him she had been engaged once, briefly, to a man named Frederick Hollis who had been charming and well-dressed, and who had broken the engagement when she refused to stop working at the library after they married because, he said, it reflected poorly on his capacity to provide. She told Matthew this because she wanted him to know the shape of her history before she said anything else, before she decided anything. She wanted her secrets laid out in the open air where they could be examined. Matthew wrote back and said that Frederick Hollis sounded like a man who was afraid of his own inadequacy and had tried to cure it by diminishing her, and that any man who would ask a woman to abandon her mind as the price of his love was selling a false bargain, and that the library was lucky to have her, and she would be lucky to leave it for something real. That letter arrived on a Tuesday in late July. Mabel sat with it at the small desk in her rented room above the dry goods store on Blake Street for a very long time. She had not agreed to anything. She had not promised to come. She told herself she was still deciding, still gathering information, still being reasonable. She wrote back and asked about the winters again, about what a woman would need to bring, about whether there was a proper place to store books away from the damp, about whether the people of Harlan Creek were open to having a schoolteacher come among them. She did not ask about the personal nature of his interest in having her come. She was not ready for that conversation yet, and she thought he would understand her caution. And she was right because his reply addressed every practical question with precision and thoroughness, and only at the very end, in the last paragraph, did he permit himself to say that he hoped she would consider coming, that he believed she would find the valley worth her trouble, and that he would do whatever was necessary to make the arrangement work. Whatever was necessary. She had not understood, when she read that line, that whatever was necessary would include a hammer and nails and fresh-cut pine, and a window facing east. On the 15th of August, 1883, Mabel Dugan packed 1 large trunk and 1 canvas bag, and told her landlady Mrs. Fortner that she was leaving Denver for a situation in the mountains, paid her the 2 weeks she owed, and arranged to ride with Hector the freighter who was making a supply run to the settlements in the San Juan foothills. She told herself she was going to look. She told herself she could always come back. She told herself the fact that she had taken every single one of Matthew Vaughn's letters and folded them neatly into the very bottom of her trunk was not a statement about anything. Now she was standing in the pale golden light of a late afternoon in the Colorado mountains, her trunk still on the wagon, her bag over her shoulder, looking at a room that a man had built for her before she had told him she was coming, before she had agreed to a single thing. And the room was beautiful and exactly right, and she had absolutely no idea what to do about that. Matthew Vaughn came down the porch steps slowly, as if he was giving her time to run if she needed to. He was taller than she had imagined, leaned through the shoulders in the way that real outdoor work makes a man, with hands that bore the marks of both ranch labor and, she would later discover, careful reading, the slight flattening at the fingertip from turning pages. His face was weathered but not hardened. There was something open about it, something that had refused to close. He stopped about 6 feet from her. He still had not put his hat back on. "I know you didn't say you were coming," he said. "You wrote that you might, that you were thinking on it." "I wrote that I was considering the situation," Mabel said, keeping her voice steady. "I asked questions." "Yes." "I did not tell you I was coming until 4 days ago." "No," she looked at the room again. "You didn't start building 4 days ago." "No," he said again. There was no deception in him. She would learn this about Matthew Vaughn over the coming months, that he would not dissemble, that it was not in his nature, that whatever he was honest about it even when honesty was uncomfortable. "I started building it 3 weeks ago." Mabel turned that over in her mind. 3 weeks ago she had written to tell him she was seriously considering making the journey. She had said seriously considering. She had not said yes. "That is a considerable leap from seriously considering," she said. Matthew looked at the ground for a moment and then back at her, and she saw a flash of something vulnerable in his expression, something he was not trying to hide. "I know it is. And I want you to understand something, Miss Dugan. I did not build it to trap you. I did not build it to make you feel obligated. I built it because I have been alone in this valley for 4 years, and I have built everything here with my own hands. And for the first time in 4 years, I was building something I wanted to build, something I was glad to be building, and I couldn't stop." The silence after that was the kind that a person has to decide what to do with. Mabel looked at the room for a long moment. She looked at the east window. She looked at Matthew Vaughn's hands, which were now working his hat brim in a slow circle again, the only visible sign of his nerves. "Is there a lock on the door?" she asked. He blinked. "I haven't hung the door yet." "Is there a lock for when you do?" Something shifted in his face. "I can put one on." "Then I'll stay tonight," Mabel said, "and we'll talk about the school." She saw the breath leave him, saw his shoulders come down a fraction of an inch. He nodded, careful not to show too much, careful not to frighten her with the size of his relief. "I'll get your trunk," he said. "Hector will want paying," she said. "I know what freight costs," he said, and walked past her to the wagon, and she turned to watch him go, and she thought, standing in the last warm light of that August day in the Colorado foothills, that this might be the most reckless and the most sensible thing she had ever done, and she could not yet tell which one it was. The first evening was careful and courteous, and full of the particular electricity of 2 people who have come to know each other through the medium of letters, now discovering the 3-dimensional reality of each other. The way a voice occupies a room, the way a person moves, the unexpected small details that no letter can capture. Matthew Vaughn made coffee on the wood stove and served it with a seriousness that suggested he had considered how it should be made and done his best. The coffee was excellent. Mabel noted this as important information about his character. He had set the table with 2 plates and 2 cups and a cloth that was clean and pressed, and she understood that he had been preparing for her arrival even while he was pretending not to know she was arriving for certain. and she found this more touching than she wanted to admit. He had cooked a simple supper of salt pork and cornbread, and a bowl of early apple preserves that one of the neighboring families had brought over, he said, when they heard there might be a school teacher coming to the valley. She asked him to tell her about the families. The Pratt family, he said, had homesteaded the upper end of the valley 5 years ago. Silas Pratt was a quiet, hard-working man from Missouri. His wife Agnes was fierce and practical and deeply religious. And they had 4 children, the oldest of whom, a boy named Thomas, was 11 and hungry for learning in the way that some children are, as if they are born knowing they need it. The 3 younger Pratt children were between 5 and 9. The Hendersons had come the following year, Walt and Dinah Henderson, both originally from Ohio, who ran a small hog operation in addition to their garden and kept chickens and were, Matthew said, the most cheerful family he had encountered in the West, cheerful in the genuine way rather than the desperate way, and they had 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6. The third family, the Garcias, had been in the valley the longest, having come up from New Mexico territory when Domingo Garcia had tired of working other men's land and wanted his own. His wife Luz was the person who had first told the other valley residents that Matthew had been corresponding with a potential school teacher, a fact which Matthew disclosed with a slightly pained expression that made Mabel laugh out loud for the first time since she had arrived. "Luz Garcia knows your business?" she asked. "Luz Garcia knows everyone's business," Matthew said. "She is not malicious about it. She is simply very observant and very interested in people, and she asked me one morning why I had been riding to the post station at Harlan so frequently, and I told her the truth because lying to Luz Garcia is a project that ends in humiliation." "I think I will like her," Mabel said. "She will like you," he said. "She has already decided she will." They talked through the supper and into the evening, and the lamp burned low and they did not notice. And at some point, Mabel looked up and realized that 2 hours had passed in the space of what felt like 20 minutes, that she had been talking about the Cincinnati Library and the way she had organized the cataloging system and her theories on how children learn to read, and Matthew had been listening with his whole attention, his elbows on the table, his coffee forgotten. And she had the sensation that was both wonderful and frightening of being seen, of being actually and genuinely seen by someone who found what he was seeing interesting. She excused herself before she could say anything she wasn't ready to say. The new room had a rope bed with a good cornhusk mattress and 2 quilts folded at the foot, and the east window was open to let in the cool mountain air that smelled of pine and creek water, and Mabel lay in the dark listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the valley, the creek murmur, the occasional distant call of a night bird, the absolute blanketing quiet that she had not known could exist after 2 years of Denver's noise. She lay there and thought about Matthew Vaughn building this room. She thought about what it meant that a man who had chosen his words so carefully in every letter had allowed himself this reckless, revealing act, this construction of hope before permission was granted. She thought it might be the most honest thing anyone had ever done for her. She fell asleep in the mountain quiet and did not dream of Cincinnati. In the morning she woke to the sound of the cattle being moved and the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and she rose and dressed and stepped out into a Colorado morning so crisp and bright it made her throat ache. The meadow below the east ridge was still partially shadowed, but the upper peaks caught the early sun and blazed gold and pink, and the creek caught the light and threw it back in moving pieces, and she stood on the porch of the new room and breathed in and thought with a clarity that surprised her that she was staying. She had not told Matthew this yet. She watched him come up from the barn, long-legged and unhurried in the way of men who have done their work every morning for years, and he saw her on the porch and lifted a hand in greeting, not presuming, not rushing. "Coffee's on," he called. "I know," she said. "I smelled it from the east window." A pause. "You slept all right." "Better than I have in months," she said honestly. He didn't say anything to that, but the quality of his silence was pleased. Over the next 3 days, Mabel walked the valley and met its people, and Harlan Creek laid itself out before her like a slow, generous gift. Luz Garcia was exactly as advertised. A compact, bright-eyed woman of 40 who had a gift for reading people that bordered on the unnerving, who served Mabel the best tamales she had ever tasted and talked freely about everything, and everyone in the valley, without a trace of the malice that would have made it gossip rather than simply information. She looked at Mabel with bright dark eyes and said, in a voice pitched for no one else to hear, that Matthew Vaughn had been different since the letters started coming. Better, she said, more like a man who has something to look forward to. Mabel did not tell her what she felt about that. She ate the tamales instead and asked about the children. Agnes Pratt showed Mabel the one-room space in the Pratt's outbuilding that the families had agreed could be cleared and used as a schoolroom if a teacher came. It was clean and well-lit, and larger than Mabel had expected, with good ventilation and a south-facing window that would let in winter sun. Agnes Pratt was formal and a little guarded, but when Mabel asked about Thomas, the 11-year-old, Agnes's face went soft in a way that showed everything under the armor, and she said he could read already, that he had taught himself from a Bible and a seed catalog, and a copy of a Walter Scott novel that Matthew Vaughn had lent him, and that she didn't know what would become of him if he didn't get proper schooling. That a boy like that could either become something fine or become something that went to ruin for want of direction. Mabel understood that Agnes Pratt was asking her something as much as she was telling her something. Dinah Henderson was warm and laughing and pressed Mabel's hand between both of hers when they met, and said that the whole valley had been hoping for this, that children needed letters and numbers, and they needed someone who cared about giving those things. And she could see that Mabel was that person. She could just see it. Mabel rode back to Matthew's cabin that evening on the gentle mare he had lent her, a black and white paint called Sage, and she thought about belonging. She had not felt she belonged anywhere since Cincinnati had turned its back on her family. Denver had been a place to work and survive, not a place to put down roots. But 3 days in this valley had given her the disorienting sensation of fitting, of her edges matching the edges of the space she had walked into. Matthew was splitting wood when she came in off the trail. He looked up and she could see him reading her face, trying to gauge how the day had gone, how she was feeling about the valley, about the situation, about all of it. Dinah Henderson made me promise to come to supper Sunday, Mabel said, sliding down from Sage and running a hand along the mare's neck. She'll feed you half her larder and ask you your full history, he said. She's not prying, she just loves people. I gathered that. Mabel turned the mare toward the corral gate and Matthew came to take the reins, their hands briefly adjacent without touching, a proximity that was suddenly and sharply noticeable. I'd like to start the school, she said. He went very still. When? 2 weeks from Monday. I'll need to take an accounting of what the children know and don't know. I'll need to go through the 47 books and see what's useful. I'll need to draw up a list of supplies I'll want from Harlan. I'll take you to Harlan whenever you want to go, he said. I can bring in whatever you need. I have $22, she said. That's yours, he said immediately. The families have some funds set aside. They've been hoping for this for 2 years. I won't take wages I haven't earned. You can argue that out with Silas Pratt, he said. He's the one who organized the fund. She turned to face him fully and found him closer than she expected. Though he had not moved closer, she had simply not realized how close they were standing, with the mare warm between them and the last of the day's light going golden in the air. I'm staying, she said. I should tell you that plainly. The silence he took before responding was not the silence of a man unmoved. It was the silence of a man who is holding something very carefully because he is afraid of breaking it. I'm glad, he said, just that. I'm glad. The simplicity of it was somehow more powerful than any elaborate expression could have been, and Mabel felt it land in the center of her chest and stay there. She took Sage into the corral and Matthew went back to his wood, and neither of them said anything else about it that evening, but the air between them had changed, had acquired a new quality, the quality of something acknowledged. 2 weeks later, Mabel opened the school. She had spent those 2 weeks building it the same way she built everything, from the ground up, with attention and intelligence, and a refusal to do things halfway. She sat with each child individually to understand what they knew. Thomas Pratt, the 11-year-old, proved to be as remarkable as his mother had implied, reading at a level far above his years, with a voracious, undisciplined hunger for knowledge that Mabel recognized immediately as something to be shaped rather than contained. She spent an extra hour with him on the first day, and they argued passionately about whether the way a person told a story mattered as much as what the story said. And Thomas held his own with a ferocity that made Mabel's chest swell with something that was entirely teacher-like and entirely personal at the same time. The Henderson children were sweet and eager, and immediately attached themselves to Mabel with a trust that touched her. The youngest Garcia child, a girl of 5 named Rosa, arrived on the first day holding her mother's hand with an expression of terrified determination, and by the end of the second hour was sitting on Mabel's lap while Mabel read aloud from a volume of illustrated natural history. Matthew watched all of this from a careful distance. He did not hover. He did not interfere. He brought lumber from Harlan to build proper desks, 3 of them, solid and well-made, installed without being asked, without comment, without any indication that he wanted credit. He simply appeared one Saturday with the wood and tools and built 3 desks and carried them to the schoolroom and came home and made supper, and when Mabel thanked him, he looked almost uncomfortable about it. "Children need a proper desk to write at," he said. "It's not a matter of generosity, it's a matter of sense." "It's both," she said. He handed her the coffee pot and their fingers overlapped on the handle for a moment, and both of them noticed, and neither of them said anything about it, but they were both thinking about it for the rest of the meal. September arrived with a crispness in the air and the first hints of color on the aspens along the upper ridge, and Harlan Creek went about its work, and Mabel Dugan settled into a life she had not planned and found, to her ongoing slight amazement, that it fit her better than anything she had deliberately arranged for herself ever had. The dark history she had been carrying, the shame of her father's debts, the broken engagement, the sense of being too much and not enough simultaneously for the world she had grown up in, these things did not disappear in the mountains, but they became less definitive, less central, as if the altitude put them in proper proportion. She and Matthew talked every evening. It became the structure of the day, the given endpoint toward which the hours moved, supper cooked and eaten at the main cabin's table, and then the long conversation afterward that ranged across everything and nothing, history and weather, and what Thomas Pratt had said today that suggested he had been thinking about something extraordinary and what that might mean for his future, and what the range looked like from the east pasture that morning, and what she had read the night before in the east room. She began to hear herself in those conversations differently. She began to notice that the voice she used with Matthew was not a performance or a negotiation. It was simply her voice. She said what she thought. He said what he thought. When they disagreed, which happened with some regularity because they were both opinionated people with strongly formed views on a variety of subjects, the disagreement had a texture of engagement rather than conflict, like 2 people pushing against each other in a way that made both of them more sure of where they were standing. One evening in late September, a cold rain came in off the mountains, and they sat by the fire in the main room with coffee, and Matthew pulled the volume of Shakespeare from the shelf, the same one he had mentioned in his early letters, the one he had found wedged under a fence post in the winter of 1880, and he read to her. He had a good reading voice, quiet and precise with a slight Tennessee lift to it that gave the language a different music than she had heard it before, and she sat across from him with her coffee cup warm between her palms and listened and felt the forbidden luxury of this, of being comfortable, of being in a place where the storm outside was the thing kept at bay rather than the storm inside. You know, she said, when he stopped between scenes, I had a very clear picture of you from the letters. And you are not quite that person. He looked up. Am I worse? No, she said, you're more. She hadn't meant to say that quite that directly, and she watched his face process it, watched something warm and careful move through his expression. I had a clear picture of you too, he said, and you are exactly that person, he said, and also considerably more. The fire cracked. The rain hit the windows. Something had shifted irrevocably between them, and they both knew it, and neither of them was ready to say what it was yet, but it was there, visible in the room as surely as the firelight. In the first week of October, a rider came into the valley from Harlan with a letter from Mabel, and Matthew brought it up from the post station without opening it or asking about it, and she read it in the east room with her heart going strange and uneven in her chest. The letter was from Frederick Holly's. She had not heard from Frederick in 2 years. She had not thought about Frederick she realized now, several months, possibly since the day she had first arrived in the valley. He had written to her Denver address and it had been forwarded. He was in Denver now, he said. He had come west for a business venture. He had thought of her. He had heard she had gone into the mountains. He wondered if she was well. He said that he had made mistakes in his thinking, and that he believed he had been wrong about certain things, and that he would very much like to see her if the opportunity presented itself. He did not say he was sorry. He used a great many words, and not a single one of them was an apology. Mabel sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about who she had been when she was engaged to Frederick Holly's, younger and less sure of herself, wanting his approval in a way that she now recognized as having been a kind of diminishment, a willingness to make herself smaller in order to fit inside someone else's idea of who she should be. She thought about what she would have felt receiving this letter a year ago. She thought about what she felt receiving it now. What she felt was very little, and what she felt most clearly was relief that she felt very little. She folded the letter and did not respond to it that day or the next. She went to school and taught her 7 students, and argued with Thomas Pratt about the French Revolution, and helped Rosa Garcia form the letter R for the 14th time, and came home through the sharp autumn air, and made supper with Matthew and sat by the fire. On the 3rd evening after the letter arrived, she told him about it. She did not know entirely why she told him, except that she had come to understand that the absence of honesty between them would be the beginning of distance, and distance was the thing she was least willing to have from Matthew Vaughn. He listened without speaking until she was done. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "I'm going to write him a brief and polite reply saying that I am well and that I have a situation here that suits me and that I wish him well. That's all. That's all." Matthew was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "Mabel," he said, and the way he said her name, not Miss Dugan, her name, was something she felt in her sternum. "Yes. I know I have no right to tell you what to feel about a man from your past," he said slowly. "And I'm not trying to, but I want you to know something. I want you to know that whatever you decide about this valley, about the school, about me, I want it to be what you actually want. Not what you've settled for, not what's available, what you want." She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. She said, "Why would you say that?" "Because," he said carefully, "I am a man who built a room onto his cabin before a woman agreed to come. I am aware that there is a kind of presumption in that could look like pressure. I want you to know that it was not meant as pressure. I wanted you here because I wanted you here, not to obligate you. I know that," she said. "Do you?" "Yes," she said. "I do." She set down her coffee cup. "Matthew, I was not settled for anything when I came here. I made a choice. I keep making it every day. I made it this morning when I got up, and I will make it tomorrow morning." He was watching her with that careful, held attention she had come to know as one of the things she loved most about him, the way he listened as if what she said was important, as if her words deserved to be received properly. "I should tell you something," he said after a moment. "Tell me." He was quiet for the length of time it takes a careful man to make a decision. "Before I wrote that letter to the newspaper," he said, I had been alone in this valley for 3 years. I had my work and my land and my cattle, and none of it felt like enough. Not because it wasn't good land or good work, but because I had nobody to tell about it. I had nobody to sit with in the evening and say, "Did you see the way the light came off the ridge this morning? Did you read the part where the man realizes what he's lost?" I had built everything I could build with my hands, and I had nothing left to build. And then I wrote that letter and you wrote back, and I had something to think about again. Something to look forward to. He stopped. He looked at his hands. "I am saying this badly." "You are saying it perfectly," Mabel said, and her voice was not entirely steady. He looked up. "I have been looking forward to every morning since I came here," she said. "I have been looking forward to the school and the children and the conversations and the coffee and the fire and the way the creek sounds at night. And I have been looking forward to you, Matthew. I have been looking forward to you most of all." The room was very quiet. Matthew Vaughn stood up from his chair, and Mabel Dugan stood up from hers, and they met in the middle of the space between them, which was not very much space at all, and he took her hands in both of his, and she looked up at his face and found it open and honest and quietly joyful in the way of a person who has stopped bracing for a blow because the blow is not coming. "I would very much like to court you properly," he said. "You have been courting me since the third letter," she told him. "I would like to do it less by correspondence," he said. She laughed, and his smile broke open, and she understood in that moment that she had not yet seen him smile like that, without any reservation in it, and it changed his face into something so warm that she felt it across her whole body. They did not kiss that night. That was not a failing but a fact, the fact of two people who are being careful with something they have decided is precious. He walked her to the door of the east room and said good night with her hand still in his. And she went inside to the good mattress and the east window and the mountain dark, and she lay looking at the ceiling with her heart full in a way she could not remember it being full before. October deepened toward November, and the courtship was a real and daily thing. The declaration made and understood without formal ceremony, the valley somehow aware of it, the knowing glances of Luz Garcia, and the warm smile of Dinah Henderson, and the gruff, pleased nod of Silas Pratt, who had apparently understood the situation before most people had thought to consider it. There were rides in the early mornings before school when Matthew showed her the valley's remoter corners, the beaver ponds in the upper drainage, the old prospector's shack on the south slope that had been abandoned years before and was slowly being reclaimed by the aspens, the place on the east ridge where, on certain clear mornings, you could see what Matthew said were the peaks of 3 separate mountain ranges. He showed her these things the way a person shows things they love, with a quiet pride and a wish to share, and she received them the way she received everything he gave, with full attention and honest response. She told him about Cincinnati, the real Cincinnati, not the broad outline she had given in letters but the texture of it, the particular shame of watching her father's reputation collapse, the way her mother had retreated into bitterness as a survival strategy that had ultimately prevented any other kind of survival, the way Mabel herself had decided at the age of 20 that she would not make bitterness her survival strategy even though it was available to her. Even though the world had given her cause, he told her about Tennessee. He told her about a father who had worked a small farm with a ferocity that was indistinguishable from rage, who had loved his family in the way of a man who had no language for love except labor, and so had expressed it entirely through labor, and had consequently produced a son who worked very hard and had considerable difficulty saying what he felt out loud. He said this with self-awareness and a slight wryness that told her he had been thinking about it for a long time. He told her he had left Tennessee at 24 not because he hated it, but because he needed more room, more space between himself and the patterns he had grown up in, more sky. He told her he had found the sky but had not for a long time found the rest of it. "The rest of what?" she asked. "The reason the sky matters," he said. "You need somebody to look at the sky with." The first snow came in early November, a light dusting that melted by noon, and then a harder fall the following week that stayed on the upper slopes and filled the valley with a hush that was different from autumn's quiet, deeper and more committed. The school continued through the winter because the families were determined, and the children were willing, and Thomas Pratt, who was growing into the understanding that his intellect was genuinely unusual, had told his mother that he would walk to school in 4 feet of snow if necessary. On a Saturday in late November, Matthew drove Mabel to Harlan for supplies, a 7-mile journey on a road that was frozen hard and clear under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. They went for practical reasons. Flour and lamp oil and a particular book Mabel had written away for that had arrived at the Harlan store, and they came back with the supplies and the book, and also with a feeling between them that had shifted again, tightened and clarified, as if the cold air and the open road had demanded a kind of honesty that the cozy evenings by the fire could sometimes allow to remain unsaid. In Harlan, they had encountered a man named Carter Dale, who was the owner of a saloon and a portion of the surrounding land, and who was known, Matthew said quietly as they walked past his establishment, as a man who made his money in ways that were not always distinguishable from coercion, who had been attempting for several years to expand his land holdings in the valley by pressuring the smaller homesteaders to sell, who had so far been unsuccessful because men like Silas Pratt and Domingo Garcia did not respond well to pressure. Carter Dale came out of his saloon as they were loading the wagon, and he looked at Mabel with the particular look of a man taking inventory of something he might want to acquire, and he said, with a friendliness that did not reach his eyes, that he had heard there was a schoolteacher come to Harlan Creek, and that he was glad to meet her, and that it was something to have a fine-looking woman out in the hills where the company was so limited. The way he said it was designed to insult Matthew by implication while flattering Mabel by surface, a practiced maneuver, and Mabel recognized it immediately for what it was, because she had been dealing with men who used language as a hidden weapon for her entire adult life. She looked at Carter Dale with a pleasantness entirely devoid of warmth and said that yes, she was the school teacher, and that the children of Harlan Creek were excellent students, and that the company in the valley was in fact excellent, and she found it entirely sufficient, and then she turned back to the wagon and finished loading flour. Carter Dale stood for a moment with the expression of a man who has deployed a maneuver and found it entirely ineffective, and then he went back inside. Matthew came around to her side of the wagon to help her up, and his expression was a complicated mixture of admiration and something protective that he was carefully not acting on. "He's been trying to buy out Silas Pratt for 2 years, he said quietly as they started down the road. "I know," she said. "Luz told me." "He will likely try to use you as leverage in some fashion," Matthew said. "He's the kind of man who looks at other people's lives and tries to find the pressure point." "He won't find one," Mabel said. "I know," Matthew said, and there was a certainty in it that was not dismissive but protective, and she felt again that sensation of being stood beside rather than managed, of being backed up rather than handled. On the drive home, the early dark came down and the stars appeared in the sky above the mountains one by one and then all at once, and they drove through the cold, star-thick dark on the frozen road with the horse's breath clouding ahead of them, and Matthew's arm was against hers on the bench seat of the wagon, and neither of them moved away. "Mabel," he said, about 2 miles out from the valley. "Yes. I want to ask you something." She waited. "I want to ask you formally," he said. "Not the way it's been, good as that's been. I want to ask you to marry me." The stars hung overhead. The horses moved steady on the road. The cold air held the question out between them like something glass. "You built a room onto your cabin before I agreed to come," she said. "You might have a pattern of asking the question after the fact." "I'm asking before this particular fact," he said. He was not smiling, or not entirely. He was very earnest and very still beside her. "I want to do this right." She looked at the road ahead and then at the dark shape of the mountains against the star-filled sky, and she thought about what right meant to a man like Matthew Vaughn, what it cost him to say what he felt, what the asking itself represented after a childhood of loving being expressed only in labor and never in words. "Yes," she said. She heard his breath. She felt his arm tighten momentarily against hers. "Yes," he said. "Yes, Matthew." He said her name again, just her name, the way he said it when he meant it. And then he took her hand under the driving robe and held it for the rest of the way home. And she let him. And the stars burned white and fierce over the Colorado mountains, and the valley below was dark and waiting for them. They told the valley in December, and the valley responded in the way of people who have been following a developing situation with close attention, and are gratified to see it arrive at the conclusion they had always anticipated. Luz Garcia came to the cabin 2 days after the news spread, bringing food and an expression of total satisfaction, and sat at the kitchen table and told Mabel, with the directness that was entirely characteristic of her, that she had known from the moment Matthew started corresponding with a woman in Denver that this was how it would end, because she had never seen him write a letter in 4 years of knowing him, and a man does not start writing letters without a reason. Agnes Pratt brought a quilt she had been making, a wedding ring pattern in deep blues and reds, and said very little but pressed Mabel's hand, and her eyes were wet. And Mabel understood that Agnes's feeling was about more than congratulations. It was about the sense that the valley was becoming something more permanent, more complete, that the community was putting down roots that would hold. Thomas Pratt asked Matthew, with the directness of an 11-year-old who had been given no reason not to be direct, whether Miss Dugan would still teach school after she was married, and Matthew said that was entirely Miss Dugan's decision, and he would not presume to decide it for her. And Thomas looked relieved and said good, because he had just started reading a book about the natural sciences, and he had a great many questions. Mabel told him she would be at school Monday as usual. They were married in February of 1884, in a ceremony held at the Pratt homestead, because Agnes Pratt's parlor was the largest interior space in the valley, performed by a circuit preacher named Reverend Albright, who came through the San Juan foothills every 6 weeks, and who was a short, energetic man with a white beard, and an absolute conviction that the proper joining of 2 people in the wilderness was among the Lord's finest works. The whole valley was there, all 3 families plus 2 neighboring ranchers from the next valley over, and the freighter Hector, who had driven Mabel up from Denver 6 months before, and who appeared to have made a point of timing his next supply run to coincide with the wedding, which Mabel found inexplicably moving. She wore a dark blue dress she had made herself from fabric ordered through the Harlan store, and she wore her hair up in her mother's small pearl earrings, the only thing from her mother's household that had survived the debts and the decline. Matthew wore a clean white shirt and a good coat, and looked at her when she came into the parlor with an expression that she wanted to hold and keep. That particular expression, undisguised and openly joyful and a little awed, as if he still could not quite believe that the person he had been corresponding with had become this real and present woman who was walking toward him. Reverend Albright was brisk and sincere, and the ceremony was simple and exact. And when Matthew took her hand to say his vows, he held it the way he held everything he cared about, carefully and surely. And she felt the words he said not as formality but as truth, because she had come to know him well enough to know that he did not say things he did not mean. They came home through the February cold to the cabin that was no longer quite his cabin or quite her room but both of theirs together, and Matthew had laid a fire before the ceremony, and the cabin was warm and lit when they came in, and there was a bottle of good wine on the table that he had ridden to Harlan especially to obtain, and they sat together by the fire on their wedding night and talked and laughed and were entirely themselves, and that, Mabel thought, was the truest form of happiness she knew how to name. Spring came to the valley with the violence and beauty of all mountain springs, the snowmelt flooding the creek into a roaring, cold white torrent, the meadow grass coming up impossibly green, the aspen leaves arriving all at once on a warm April morning, as if they had been waiting behind a door for the right moment. Mabel walked the valley every morning before school and felt the particular joy of belonging to a place through its seasons, of knowing what came next because she had been there for what came before. The school continued and grew. The family's confidence in Mabel had, by spring, become something complete, and there was talk in April about whether they might petition the county for formal recognition of the Harlan Creek School, which would mean funds and possibly a proper school building. Mabel worked on the petition with Domingo Garcia, who had the clearest head for legal and official language of anyone in the valley, and they sent it to the county seat at Silverton in early May. Thomas Pratt, meanwhile, had become Mabel's most consuming and rewarding challenge. His intellect was outpacing everything she could provide from the valley's book supply, and she had begun writing to Denver for additional materials, had corresponded with the state education office about what was available to exceptional students in rural areas, and had determined with a growing conviction that Thomas Pratt was going to need to go to a proper school eventually, that the valley was going to nurture him to a certain point, and then it was going to have to let him go, and that preparing him for that was as important as anything else she could do for him. She talked to Matthew about this at length over many evenings, working through the ethics and practicalities, and Matthew listened and contributed, and one evening said something that surprised her, that the fact that she was thinking about Thomas's future beyond the valley was exactly the right thing to be thinking, because the greatest thing you could give a young person was not security but capability. She looked at him across the table. "You would have been a good teacher," she said. "I had too much to build," he said. "You could still teach," she said. "Thomas needs a man who understands this land and what it asks of you. He needs that as much as he needs the books." Matthew was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been showing him what I know, out on the land." "I know," she said. "He told me." He was surprised. "What did he say?" "He said you showed him how to read weather from the mountain shapes and cloud formations, and that you told him the names of the native grasses and which ones the cattle preferred and why, and that you explained how the snowmelt feeds the aquifer and how the aquifer determines where you can and cannot plant." She looked at him steadily. "He said you were the best teacher he'd ever had except for me." Matthew looked at the table for a moment, and she could see that this had reached him in a place that was not easily reached. "He's a good boy," he said gruffly. "He's more than a good boy," she said. "He's going to be a remarkable man, and you are part of that." In the summer of 1884, Carter Dale made his move. It came in the form of a lawyer from Silverton who arrived in the valley one July morning, with papers that Carter Dale claimed entitled him to a portion of the water rights on Harlan Creek, rights that he contended had been improperly allocated when the original land grants were issued, rights that, if established, would allow him to reduce the water flow to the Upper Valley homesteads in dry years, and effectively make farming and ranching on those properties untenable. The lawyer, a thin man named Moss with an air of practiced apology, served the papers on Silas Pratt and Domingo Garcia and handed a notice to Matthew as well, and the three men came together that evening at the Garcia homestead to look at the documents by lamplight and understand what they were dealing with. Mabel sat with them. She was not there as Matthew's wife to provide company. She was there because she had a better organized mind for this kind of document than any of them, and she knew it, and they knew it, and no one felt the need to comment on the arrangement. She read the papers twice through, and then she said that Carter Dale's claim rested on a clerical error in the original territorial water allocation documents from 1879. An error that had assigned a creek designation incorrectly, and that if they could obtain the original survey documents from the Territorial Land Office and demonstrate the error, the claim would collapse. The documents would be in Silverton or possibly in Denver. Domingo Garcia looked at her steadily for a moment and then said, "Can you write that down? What you need and where it would be?" "I already am," she said, because she had been writing notes throughout the reading. Matthew rode to Silverton the following week, and then to Denver, a trip that took 2 weeks total, and Mabel managed the valley's daily concerns in his absence, with a competence that surprised no one who knew her and might have surprised her earlier self. The woman who had sat in the Denver library 2 years before eating a hard-boiled egg and wondering what was next. She organized the school and managed the small financial matters Matthew had left in her care, and wrote to the state education office about Thomas, and rode the fence lines twice a week, and fed the horses, and felt, in the strange solitude of Matthew's absence, a more complete sense of herself than she had expected. He came back with the documents. He came back with a full accounting of the original survey that demonstrated definitively that the creek designation in question referred to a different waterway entirely, that Carter Dale's lawyer had either been misled or had misled himself, and that the claim was fraudulent. They filed a response through a Silverton attorney, and the claim was dismissed by October. Carter Dale was never heard from in the valley again. He sold his Harlan interests in early 1885 and moved on to other enterprises in other places, and the valley breathed a collective relief and went back to its work. The September after they were married, Mabel discovered she was expecting. She told Matthew on a Tuesday evening in the way that she told him everything important, directly and without ceremony, because they had built the habit of honesty with each other, and it had become as natural as breathing. She watched his face go through a sequence of expressions, surprise first, then something that moved deeper and was less easy to name, and then an open and uncomplicated joy that made her feel the way his reading of Shakespeare had made her feel in the first weeks, the warmth of being in the same space as someone who is genuinely happy. He stood up from the table and came around to her side, and she stood up, and he held her for a long time in the lamplit kitchen, not dramatically, just standing together with his hand at the back of her head, and she listened to his heartbeat through his shirt and thought that this was the thing no letter could have told her, the physical fact of this man, the warmth and solidity of him. "A boy or a girl," he said finally, "I don't care which." "You say that now," she said into his shoulder. "I mean it," he said. "I just want them to be yours." She pulled back to look at him. "Yours too," she said. "Yes," he said, "that's what I meant." Their son was born in June of 1885, in the cabin at Harlan Creek, delivered by Luz Garcia and Dinah Henderson, who between them had attended more than a dozen births, and who managed the whole enterprise with a calm authority that Mabel found, in the foggy clarity of that particular experience, deeply reassuring. Matthew sat outside on the porch through most of it, which was the established practice, but Luz appeared at the door near the end and said that Mabel had asked for him, and he was in the room for the last minutes, and he held his son before the cord was cut, which was not the common custom, but was what happened because Mabel told Luz she wanted it that way, and Luz, who believed that the mother's wishes were the law of the birth room, saw to it that it was done. They named him Samuel, after Matthew's older brother who had died in Tennessee of a fever when they were children, and after no one in particular who had wronged Mabel or to whom she owed any debt of memory. Samuel was a name that belonged to the future rather than the past, a new name for a new life. Thomas Pratt came to see the baby when Samuel was 3 days old, and he stood holding the infant with the careful, wondering expression of an almost 13-year-old who is confronting for the first time the complete reality of another human being who is entirely new, and he said that the baby looked like he was thinking about something important. "He probably is," Mabel said. Thomas looked at her. "What do babies think about?" "Everything they're learning," she said. "They don't stop learning from the first moment. Every sensation is new information." Thomas considered this. "So he's already in school." "He's already in school," she agreed. Thomas handed the baby carefully back to her and said that he thought he understood what she had been telling him about learning being something you chose rather than something that happened to you, and she looked at him, this 13-year-old with the large mind and the serious face, and she thought that whatever else this valley gave her, it had given her Thomas Pratt, and that was not a small thing. In the fall of 1885, the county formally recognized the Harlan Creek School and allocated a modest annual fund for its operation. This was in no small part due to the petition Mabel and Domingo Garcia had filed, and the follow-up correspondence Mabel had conducted with the County Board of Education. And it was also due to the letter that the state education inspector had written after making a visit to the Valley School in late summer. A letter that described the educational outcomes in Harlan Creek as, quote, among the most impressive I have encountered in a rural setting in my 12 years of inspection, and entirely a credit to the teacher's devotion and capability. Mabel read this letter without showing it to anyone except Matthew, and Matthew read it and then set it down on the table and looked at her with an expression that was both proud and something quieter, something she had come to recognize as the way he looked when he thought about the distance she had traveled to arrive here. "Your father's old colleagues in Cincinnati," he said. "The ones who watched him go down and did nothing. The ones who let you and your mother carry it alone. What about them?" "Nothing," he said. "I just think about them sometimes, and about the school board that said your temperament was too independent, and about Frederick Holly's, and I think," he said carefully, "that it is possible that every one of them did you the enormous service of not seeing what you were, so that you had to come out here where someone could." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me." "The bar was not high," he said, and she threw a dish towel at him. The winter of 1885 to 1886 was the hardest winter the valley had known in its short-settled history. The cold came early and stayed, the kind of cold that was not theatrical about itself, but simply occupied the landscape with an absolute patient severity, temperatures dropping to 20 and then 30 below in January, the creek freezing solid, the snow accumulating on the upper slopes to depths that the old-timers, the ones who had been in the mountains before the homesteaders, said they had not seen in a generation. They got through it the way the valley got through everything together. Matthew and Domingo and Silas Pratt organized a rota for checking on the livestock across all 3 homesteads, sharing labor and watching for the signs of trouble that deep cold brought, frozen water lines, cattle who would not eat, the particular danger of drifting snow that could trap and bury. Mabel kept the school going through December, and then suspended it in January when the cold made the walk dangerous for the younger children, bringing the older ones to the cabin instead, where the stone fireplace that Matthew had built, and that Drew clean, as he had told her in his second letter, kept the main room warm even against the mountain's worst efforts. She taught Thomas Pratt at the kitchen table by the fire while Samuel slept in his cradle nearby, and the snow drove against the windows, and they read natural philosophy and discussed mathematics, and worked through a grammar of ancient Latin that Mabel had obtained through a Denver bookseller, because Thomas, who was now 13 and reaching for every rung he could find, had decided he wanted to understand where the English language came from. Matthew sat with them sometimes in the evenings and listened, and occasionally contributed, and on one February night when the temperature outside was at its most murderous, and the fire was burning high and orange and Samuel slept in his cradle between them, Thomas said that he thought he wanted to go to college someday, said it with the tentative bravery of someone who has been thinking a large thought and is testing whether the world will allow it to exist out loud. The silence was a good silence. Matthew said, "Tell me what you mean when you say college." Thomas said that there was a state school in Boulder, the University of Colorado, which had opened in 1877. He had read about it in a newspaper that Mabel had obtained in Harlan. He said that he knew it was a long way and that it cost money and that he would have to pass examinations, but that he thought he might be able to if he kept working. Matthew looked at Mabel across the table. She looked back. "We'll help you get ready," Matthew said. Thomas blinked. "You will. That's what Miss Mabel has been doing every day for 2 years," Matthew said. "Getting you ready. We're not going to stop because the goal got larger." Thomas said nothing for a moment. Then he said with a careful dignity, "I'll pay it back." "You'll pass it forward," Mabel said. "That's the same thing." February gave way to March, and the cold broke with the decisiveness that only mountain winters are capable of. the temperature rising 20 degrees in a single day, the creek cracking loose from its ice, the sound of water returning to the valley like a kind of homecoming. The valley emerged from the winter intact, all three families, all the cattle, all the horses, all the children, and there was a quality to the spring that arrived after that hard winter of something earned, something known deeply because it had been held onto against resistance. Mabel stood on the porch of what was now simply their home, having long since ceased to think of it as the cabin and the room, having long since made the whole space entirely theirs, with Samuel on her hip and the morning light coming across the meadow in long horizontal shafts that caught the new grass and turned it luminous, and Matthew came up behind her and put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together and watched the valley come back to life. "I have been thinking," she said. "Tell me." "I want to write to the state board about establishing a proper school building for the valley, a dedicated structure, not the outbuilding at the Pratt place, something built for purpose." "All right," he said. "I'll help you write the proposal." "I know you will," she said. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Samuel reached out and grabbed a fistful of Matthew's collar with his small, determined fist, and Matthew looked down at his son with the expression he always wore when he looked at Samuel, that uncomplicated, wondering love, and said, "He's going to be stubborn." "I wonder where he gets that," Mabel said. "His mother," Matthew said, and she elbowed him and he laughed, the laugh she had come to know best, the one that was full and unguarded, the laugh of a man who has stopped bracing. In the spring of 1886, she wrote to the state board, and by fall they had a commitment for a school-building fund. It would take 2 years to materialize, but it was committed, and commitments had a way of becoming real if you kept working on them. That same spring, Thomas Pratt turned 14, and Mabel began preparing him in earnest for the university examinations, now 4 years away. Writing to the University of Colorado for their requirements, reading through the examination syllabi with Thomas, and mapping out what he needed, working with a methodical urgency that felt to her like one of the most important things she had done with her education, this particular transmission of it. This specific young mind that she was helping build toward its potential. She also, with Thomas's knowledge and his parents' slightly odd permission, wrote a letter to a professor at the University of Colorado named Dr. Harold Fitch, who specialized in natural sciences and who had published several papers she had obtained through a Denver academic bookseller, describing Thomas Pratt, his background, his capabilities, his specific intellectual character, and asking whether the professor might be willing to correspond with such a student on questions of natural philosophy. Dr. Fitch wrote back within 3 weeks saying he would be delighted, that students of genuine talent in rural settings were one of his particular concerns, and enclosing a short list of additional readings and 3 questions about geological formation that he invited Thomas to consider. Thomas Pratt sat at the kitchen table with those 3 questions for an entire Saturday and produced 4 handwritten pages of response that Mabel read twice and sent on to Dr. Fitch with a cover letter, noting that the response had been produced with no assistance and in a single sitting. Dr. Fitch's reply called it, quote, "the work of an exceptional mind." Agnes Pratt cried when she read that letter, sitting at her own kitchen table with her hands shaking slightly, and her face showing everything she usually kept so carefully organized. And she said to Mabel, who had brought the letter over, that she had known. She had always known, but that knowing and having it confirmed by a man at the university were different things, and Mabel understood that completely. Samuel took his first steps in August of 1886, lurching across the cabin floor with an expression of concentrated determination entirely his own and falling into Matthew's hands, and Matthew lifted him and held him up and said to him in the quiet, earnest voice he used with the baby, "There you go. There you go," as if he had been waiting for this specifically. By autumn of that year, Mabel knew she was expecting again, and she told Matthew on the porch this time, in the evening, with the stars just coming up over the east ridge and Samuel asleep inside. Matthew's response was the same as the first time, the surprised pleasure, the deep joy, the holding, and she thought as she stood in his arms listening to the creek and the night birds that this was what she had not known to name when she sat in the library in Denver reading a letter to the editor about 47 books. She had not known the name for what she was missing. She knew it now. It was this, the particular completeness of being known and choosing every day to be known. Their daughter was born in April of 1887, healthy and loud about it from the first moment, with a quantity of dark hair that Luz Garcia declared was the most hair she had ever seen on a newborn, and which Matthew ran his hand over with a gentleness that made Mabel watch him from the pillow with everything she felt plain on her face. They named her Clara. Clara Vaughn, who arrived in the Harlan Creek spring with the wildflowers coming up in the meadow and the aspens leafing out, and the creek running bright and full, who made her brother Samuel gaze at her from the edge of the cradle with an expression of solemn, proprietorial attention, who made Luz Garcia announce with satisfaction that the valley was putting down roots the proper way now, who made Agnes Pratt bring another quilt, this one in yellows and creams, who made Matthew Vaughn stand in the doorway of the room he had built before Mabel agreed to come, looking at his daughter and his wife in the evening light, with an expression that Mabel would remember for the rest of her life. She would remember it because it was the expression of a man who had built something true. The school building was completed in the fall of 1888, a proper timber frame structure on a piece of land donated by the Three Valley families, with 4 windows for cross-ventilation in summer, a good stone foundation, a dedicated wood stove, proper desks for 12 students, a small storage room for books and materials, and a plaque above the door that read Harlan Creek School, established 1883 at Mabel's insistence. Because the school had been running for 5 years before it had a building, and the years before the building were part of its history, the county board sent a representative for the dedication. The representative, a man from Silverton named Grant who had not expected much from a Mountain Valley settlement, spent 2 hours in the schoolroom talking with the students and came away visibly altered, telling Mabel afterward that the level of educational attainment in the valley was remarkable and that he intended to submit a report to the state board. Thomas Pratt, now 16, gave a short address at the dedication that he had written himself, about what education meant to him, about what it meant to grow up in a place where the people around you believed your mind was worth investing in, about what it meant to have a teacher who saw you clearly and then spent years building you toward what she saw. He delivered it with the gravity and precision of a young man who has learned to say what he means, because he has been shown that what he means is worth saying. Mabel sat in the front row of the dedication with Clara in her lap and Samuel pressed against her side, and she did not trust herself to look at anyone while Thomas was speaking, and when he was done, she applauded with everyone else and looked straight ahead until her eyes cleared. Matthew's hand found hers and held it. The valley continued to grow as the 1880s progressed. 2 new families settled in the upper drainage in 1888. And the school's enrollment grew to 14 children by 1889, which required Mabel to take on a part-time assistant, a young woman named Ellen Reyes, who had come west from Missouri with her family, and had been educated through high school, and who learned quickly and taught with a natural warmth that the younger children responded to beautifully. Mabel found in Ellen Reyes the particular pleasure of teaching a teacher, of passing on not just the content but the method, the philosophy, the attention to the individual child that she had been developing for 6 years, and she thought sometimes about the chain of it, the way a thing passes forward, the way Thomas Pratt would go to his university and carry what she had given him and pass it further on to people she would never meet, and the way those people would carry it further still. An infinitely extending line of given things. In 1890, Thomas Pratt, now 18 years old, sat the University of Colorado entrance examinations in Denver and passed them with the highest marks in the cohort that year. He left for Boulder in the fall on a scholarship that Dr. Fitch had helped him obtain, riding out of the valley on a September morning with his father's horse and a pack of books, and the whole valley came to see him off. He came to Mabel last, as she had expected he would, and he stood in front of her, and she looked at the 18-year-old who had been an 11-year-old with a self-taught Bible literacy and a hunger that could have gone either way, and she said to him, "You are going to do something important with this. I have known it since the first week." He said in the straightforward way that was entirely his, "I would not be going without you." "You would have found a way," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but not as this way." He shook Matthew's hand, and Matthew held his grip a moment longer than necessary and said something low that Mabel didn't hear, and Thomas nodded with an expression that said he had heard exactly what he needed to hear, and then he rode out of the valley and was gone. Agnes Pratt stood very still watching until he was out of sight, and then turned back to the community with a face that was entirely composed and entirely proud. And Mabel walked to her and took her hand, and they stood together for a moment without speaking. The valley went on. Matthew and Mabel went on. Samuel grew into a boy who combined his father's steadiness with his mother's relentless curiosity. A boy who at 6 had decided to read every book in the school library, and at 7 was asking Mabel to explain to him how river currents worked, and at 8 was following Matthew through the spring roundup with a focused attention that his father found both endearing and slightly overwhelming. Samuel was going to be a rancher, this was clear, but he was going to be a rancher who understood the science of what he was doing, and Mabel thought that was an excellent kind of rancher to be. Clara was different and equally herself, a child of great social intelligence and unstoppable will, who by age 3 had organized Samuel and 2 of the Henderson grandchildren into what she called the Meadow Club, whose purposes were not entirely clear to anyone outside it. She had her father's physical ease in the world and her mother's absolute refusal to be managed, and she was going to be, Mabel told Matthew one evening, a force of nature. "She already is," he said, watching from the window as Clara conducted some negotiation with a very large and uncooperative cat with an expression of complete certainty that the negotiation would go her way. "Where does she get that?" Mabel said. Matthew looked at her. "Her mother," he said. In the evenings they still talked. 6 years, 7 years, 8 years into their life together, and the evenings were still the structure of the day. Still the conversation that ranged across everything and landed always in the particular warmth of 2 people who are genuinely interested in each other, who have never run out of things to say because what they are saying is not performance but exchange. They had grown together in the way that living in the same place and working toward the same things and raising children together, and surviving hard winters, and fighting off fraudulent water claims and building schools, and watching exceptional young people leave valleys to become exceptional people in the larger world grows 2 people together, not identically but complementarily, not merged but bound. On a September evening in 1891, exactly 8 years after Mabel had stepped down from Hector's wagon and looked at the room that had been built for her before she agreed to come, she stood at the east window of that room, which was now a reading room and study, lined floor to ceiling with books, the window that looked out over the meadow to where the mountains turned purple in the late light, and she thought about the woman who had stood in that same spot on that first day, and asked who the room was for. She had thought then that the room was a trap or a presumption, or at the very least a deeply impolite assumption of consent. She understood now what it actually was. It was not an assumption of consent. It was an expression of hope. It was a man who did not know how to say what he wanted saying it the only way he knew how, in labor, in wood and nails, in a window placed to catch the best light, in a room built to say, "I have imagined a future that includes you, and I would like you to be in it, and I have tried to build something worthy of you, and I am asking." He had asked in the only language he fully trusted, and she had spent 8 years learning to speak it fluently. She heard him come in behind her, heard his particular footfall, the slight pause he always made at the door of the reading room because he was never entirely sure he was not interrupting something important. "Come in," she said. He came to stand beside her at the east window. He looked out at the meadow and the mountains and the late light doing its work on the sky. "Samuel has decided," he said, "that he wants to run a herd of his own by the time he's 16. He'll need to know more mathematics first," she said. "I told him that." "What did he say?" "He said he'd start tomorrow," she smiled. "He's yours." "He's ours," Matthew said, and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, into the warmth and the solidity and the familiar specific gravity of this man. And the mountains turned from gold to rose to purple in the long-lasting Colorado evening light, and the creek ran below them in the meadow, and the school building sat solid on its foundation at the far end of the valley. And inside the main room of the cabin, Clara was doing something emphatic, and Samuel was trying to negotiate with her about it, and the sounds of their children filled the house. "I never wrote and said I was coming," Mabel said. "I only said I was considering." "I know," he said. "And you built anyway." "Yes." She turned to look at him. "You never asked me once to explain why I hadn't said yes before I came. You never made it a point of grievance. You never used it to establish an obligation." "No," he said. "Why would I? Some men would have." "Some men would have," he agreed. "I didn't want you to be here because you felt you owed me something. I wanted you to be here because you wanted to be here." She looked at him for a long time, at this face she knew better than her own, this man who had learned to say what he meant and had said it to her every day for 8 years. "I wanted to be here," she said. "I have wanted to be here every single day." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, an old gesture of his, the one that had begun on their wedding night, quiet and deliberate and entirely without performance. "I know," he said against her hand. "The room," she said. "I never told you properly what I thought about the room." He raised an eyebrow. "It was the right size," she said. "The right placement. The window faces exactly the right direction. The proportions are perfect. It was the finest room I had ever been given. It was the finest thing anyone had ever built for me. And I knew, the moment I asked who it was for and you said you hoped it was for me, that I was not leaving." Matthew Vaughn looked at her for a moment with the expression she loved best, the open, unguarded one, the one without any bracing in it. "You said you were staying for one night," he said. "I lied," she said simply. He laughed, the full unguarded laugh, and pulled her close, and she went. And the evening settled over the Harlan Creek Valley in all its beauty and abundance. The creek singing over the stones in the meadow, the mountains holding their ancient shapes against the sky, the school building standing at the valley's end like a declaration of what this place had decided to be. And inside the warm cabin 2 children were building something noisy and collaborative and alive. And Matthew Vaughn held his wife at the east window, and the room around them held everything they had made of a life together. The love and the labor and the knowledge that had been built here, plank by plank and letter by letter and year by year, until it was more real and lasting than either of them had known to hope for when they first set out toward each other across the distance. He had built the room before she agreed to come. She had come and asked who it was for, and he had told her the truth, and she had stayed. And the staying had become the finest thing she had ever chosen, the most true and complete and irreplaceable fact of her life. The room and the man who built it, and the valley that held them both, and the children who filled it with noise and life, and the school at the far end, where the next generation was gathering itself for the larger world. All of it woven together into something whole, into the life she had not known to ask for because she had not yet known it was possible. Into the life she had arrived at by following the thread of 47 books and 1 honest letter, and a question asked in the August light of a Colorado afternoon that had turned out to be not a question about a room at all, but a question about whether she would let herself be known and whether she would stay. She had, she was, she always would be.